Hello, it's Dr. Ken and my teaching assistant Bear here with a lecture for my ancient Greece class that I'm calling the Hellenistic Age. So in this today, my teaching assistant will either go or stay, however she feels is appropriate. But today we're going to talk about sort of two things that are related, two major historical things in ancient Greece. One has to do with the rise of the kingdom of Macedon in the sort of ensuing power vacuums that occur after multiple conflicts. The next, and then the conquest of the Persian Empire by the kingdom of Macedon under Alexander III, known as the Great. Alexander's death in 323 marks the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic Age. So I'll talk a bit about that as well and what that's like compared to the period that we've been mainly studying, which is the Hellenic Age. So we can define the Hellenic Age roughly from about, well, 480, 479 or so BC, pardon me, around the time of the Persian Wars to 323 BC, as I say, the death of Alexander. His death marks the end of the Hellenic Age and the beginning of the Hellenistic. What does Hellenistic mean as opposed to Hellenic? Hellenic just means something like the Greek age and refers to the changed situation in Greece during that time, largely as a consequence of the Persian Wars. The Hellenistic age means something like the Hellenic age, but like being different from and therefore not the same as. When does it end, the Hellenistic age? Typically, the end is given to be about 30 BC. This is the fall of the last Greek kingdom of successors of Alexander the Great. That's Ptolemaic Egypt under Cleopatra. And does that end the Hellenistic Age in reality? I don't know. In some sense, we're still in the Hellenistic continuum, because though Greece is conquered by Rome, that includes the Greek East, which was the empire of Alexander, the Greek culture ends up dominating Roman culture. And so when Rome splits into two, which, not long after the West then falls, we get the Greek Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which is largely, again, Greek dominated for 1,000 years after the fall of the West. So in many regards, the Hellenistic Age just continues into that kind of bubble as the Eastern Empire shrinks and becomes just the city-state of Constantinople. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Turks and the ethnic cleansing of Greeks in what used to be their empire, people from Constantinople, scholars in particular, fled to Europe, and they went to Florence, amongst other places, and sparked our own Renaissance, which in many regards picks up the Hellenistic Age once again and carries it on into modernity. So our modern world is in some sense a kind of extension of the Hellenistic Age, which arguably has never ended, although it's undergone many transformations. But we're mainly concerned with that period following the death of Alexander when referring to the Hellenistic Age. But I'll go through and talk about what goes on in Greece that leads to this. And of course, it could have been a very different picture, had things turned out differently. We've seen how Athens was defeated in the Peloponnesian Wars. They were the Greek superpower, reduced to a second-rate power, even with an empire still, but a much smaller one. So their role on the geopolitical stage of ancient Greece is much reduced. Sparta is in ascendancy then afterwards, and so really they come to dominate from about 395 BC. So 404 is the end of the war. From 404 to about 395, Sparta is the dominant power, but they get involved in some conflicts really all over. This is often what happens to superpowers. They become the policemen or police persons of their world. So we get the Corinthian War from about 395 to 387, and this pitted Sparta against a coalition of four allied states: Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos. And it's interesting because these people didn't always make good bedfellows. The Thebans had called for the destruction of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, and here they are aligned with Athens. Argos had always been a kind of enemy of Sparta, or resistant to Spartan control, but not readily aligned with, pardon me, the Ionians in the north, and Corinth, of course, often went its own way. These allied states were, interestingly enough, backed by Persia. So Persia is still smarting from its losses in the Persian Wars. It seems to have gone into a kind of downward spiral, but even so, it's still the global superpower, although albeit past its sell-by date. And like many a modern superpower in the same situation, it's still very active on the world scene. And so Persia is influencing affairs, as we know it influenced the Peloponnesian Wars by giving money and support to Sparta. It's giving money and support to this coalition to fight against the Spartans. The Persian foreign policy seems to have shifted from conquest to attempted destabilization, and it meant funding rival factions, whoever they were, with no sense of loyalty to them. The immediate cause of the Corinthian War was a local conflict in northwest Greece, in which both Thebes and Sparta had intervened. The deeper cause, though, was hostility towards Sparta, provoked by their hegemony, that means their exerting of influence, in Asia Minor, central and northern Greece, and even into Italy. So after a series of conflicts, an agreement was reached called the Peace of Antalcidas, named after the Spartan king. This is in 387. It's sometimes referred to as the King's Peace, and not unambiguously, it's sometimes thought of as being the peace imposed by the Persian king Artaxerxes II at that time. Sometimes it's called the Common Peace. So the Persian king seems to have put his seal of approval over this peace, although the Spartan king seems to take credit for it, at any rate, one of the Spartan kings. Ionia is again ceded back to Persia, so it's changed hands a couple of times now, but it's given back to the Persians. But some Greeks will pick up that cause a bit later on. Many of the Greek states remained independent. Corinth, though, was restored to the Spartan League, and Persia and Sparta took full advantage of the gains they had made. Persia freed of both its Athenian and Spartan interference in its Asian provinces, consolidated its hold over the Aegean, and captured both Egypt and Cyprus. Egypt had revolted, but they captured Cyprus by 380. Sparta is still sort of at the top of the hierarchy. It punishes disloyal allies and continues to try and spread its dominance into the Peloponnese and the Chalcidic Peninsula. So this is the period of Spartan dominance. As with other powers that had dominated, they are resented by many people, and not the least being Thebes itself. So Thebes becomes the emerging superpower at this time, and it had always been a kind of powerful state, but obviously never as powerful as Athens or Sparta, but it's beginning to be. And they take a page or a chapter from the Spartan book. So they realize the Spartan military success is down to having professional soldiers, which no other city-state really has, although they'll hire mercenaries sometimes, which are professionals. It's a kind of increase in mercenary companies during this period, and that continues. But anyway, the Thebans then imitate the Spartan technique. They produce an army at state expense. This is the Sacred Band of the 300. So these are 300 professional soldiers trained by the state, and they're lovers. They're chosen for being in some sort of erotic relationship. The idea behind this being that they would fight better, being afraid of being shamed in front of their lovers. If you read Plato's Symposium, Pausanias in his speech discusses them and praises the practice. Although interestingly, in Xenophon's Symposium, Pausanias criticizes it. That's Xenophon for you. Thebes is the rising power. It's come to dominate the region of Boeotia around it. That'll come back to haunt it in the future, but it then comes up against Sparta, and probably the, uh, the Thebans are getting Spartan gold. So even though the king's peace is in some sense ratified by the Persian king, sorry, did I say Spartan gold? Persian gold. The Persians are giving money to the Thebans probably to fight against the Spartans. And so we get, this culminates in the Battle of Leuctra. I put more in the notes, but you can see for yourself in 371, where the sacred band rolls back the Spartans. And if you look at the battle plan, or the map of the battle that I put up on the screen, you'll see that the majority of the forces fighting on the Spartan side were not Spartans, they were allies. The Spartans are always a minority, and their numbers seem to have decreased quite a lot as well. As their power increased in Greece, paradoxically the number of full Spartan citizens decreased. There are all sorts of theories as to why this happened, and it might have been something to do with an increasingly exclusionary criteria for becoming citizens. So as wealth and power pour into Sparta, those who can benefit from it become fewer. Maybe. It's hard to tell what's actually going on in Sparta, except that their numbers are going down. Well, when the sacred band rolls back the Spartans who are leading, their allies, the other allies turn tail and run. And so this marks the period of Theban hegemony. Thebes will go into Spartan territory. They will de-heloth the Spartans, take away, they'll reconstitute the town of Mycenae, and free those people from the Spartans, and that it'll mark really the decline of Sparta as a power. So Thebes is the dominant power from 371, at least until 338. And what's going on here? Well, part of the problem is that, again, Thebes is not well liked by its subject states in Boeotia, but as the dominant superpower for several decades, they would take prisoners from subject states, and one of these subject states, or sort of client kingdoms, was the kingdom of Macedon, itself deeply divided. It had been under Persian control for a while. There was a lot of infighting amongst the nobles, and it was very much a kind of feudally structured state, but with an army that had some say over the government. So it's not exactly feudalism, but not unlike it. One of the princes of the royal household, a man named Philip, or a young man named Philip at that point, was taken to Thebes and kept as a guest, that means prisoner, to make sure his family stayed on side and behaved themselves. And while he was there, he lived with one of the generals, and he was a lover, apparently, of one of the generals named Pelopidas, and he seems to have studied as well another general named Epaminondas, who was the leading Theban general at the time. So Philip goes back to Macedon when his period of courteous imprisonment, or whatever you want to call it, ends, and he takes the lessons he's learned in Thebes back to Macedon. He's a prince. He's not actually the one who's intended to inherit. His brother would be his brother would end up becoming king, and he's given governorship of a region within Macedon, and he uses that to build his model army based partly on the Theban design and the Spartan, but also with some additions. So Philip used what was called the combined arms technique, using multiple attack and defense systems, we'd call them today, working together in concert. He made the soldiers carry most of their load, reduced the size of the baggage train. This made swift expeditions much more possible. The baggage train was huge for Greek armies, and it often slowed them down. He makes many advancements, as well as in the use of siege equipment and other technologies that were emerging at the time, like torsion ballistae, which could launch bolts, crossbow bolts, or bolts that would kill people at a distance. His brother is killed fighting some of their neighbors, and Philip is there with his army to revenge his brother's death, and then he becomes the king of Macedon. And Philip really, his ascendancy is quite significant. We have at the Battle of Chaeronea, 338, this is where he defeats the combined Theban and Athenian and other allied forces. Young Alexander, his son, only 16 at the time, is leading the left flank. Philip is on the right flank, and Alexander is tasked with dealing with the sacred band, and he does. Through a very clever strategy, he's able to roll them back. So the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 really marks the turning point where the Kingdom of Macedon is the preeminent superpower. In Greece, how did this happen? Philip's model army turned out to be a really effective thing. You can see in the image the Macedonian phalanx, which is different from the traditional Greek phalanx, this rectangular formation of soldiers. It's deeper, first of all, has more men in it. But the real key is this technology, this technique using what's called the sarissa, which is an extra long spear. We would probably call it a pike, that was used to prevent cavalry from getting too close. This was a technique partly developed against the Persians, who used cavalry extensively. It meant that no horseback rider could get close enough to cause damage. Pardon me. What's more, the ones in the front hold their spears down. The ones in the back hold them up, and they actually provide protection against arrows. So in addition to the armor they're wearing, that provides the protection against arrows from the phalanx, coming to the phalanx. He used, as I say, the combined arms approach. So there were slingers, there were archers, there were peltasts, who hurled smaller spears and other things. There was cavalry. This was really a major advance. The companion cavalry of the king, and then several ranks of cavalry beneath that. So armored soldiers on armored horses, a bit like medieval knights, very similar in many respects. Saddles are different. They don't have stirrups at this point, but they're still very effective. And they used both swords and, well, basically lances, as well as sometimes having archers on horseback too, like the Persians did. So this, a much larger cavalry, the modified phalanx, this technique of fighting, and the soldiers themselves carrying their own packs rather than depending on the larger baggage train, meant for lightning attacks, very quick, very swift action, and it was devastating. Nothing would exceed this until the Roman army comes along and makes further advancements in arms and strategies. But so this model army of Philip's was unleashed upon the Greek world. You can see the two maps. The one on the left shows the Kingdom of Macedon as he inherited it, and then the one on the right shows the Kingdom of Macedon and the wider hegemony of Macedonia, called the League of Corinth, it's called, which is formed after the Battle of Chaeronea. And you can see that virtually all of Greece, apart from the Kingdom of Epirus, which is allied with Macedon because Olympias, the mother of Alexander, was a princess from there, and Sparta, apart from Sparta and Epirus, all of Greece and quite a lot of the Balkans are now under Macedonian control. And it wasn't entirely through conquest. Philip had at least about 9 wives. Kings of Macedon were allowed to be polygamous, and these were often, almost invariably, political marriages. So they allied him with other kingdoms. If marriage didn't work, or couldn't work, or if the military wasn't an option, or he would prefer marriage or bribery. Say diplomacy, but diplomacy through bribery. One of the first things that Philip seizes is the what's called the Chalcidic Peninsula. This had been an Athenian-controlled area. There are gold and silver mines there. So Macedon is already kind of mineral-rich anyway, but seizing these gives Philip a lot more wealth that he can then use to pay for his army, but also to bribe people. And remember the case against Timarchus that we looked at. Timarchus was going to prosecute Aeschines for having served as an ambassador from Athens and having taken a bribe from Philip to negotiate a treaty. This is how Philip operated: marriage, conquest, or bribery, diplomacy. And it was very effective. In the end, after the Battle of Chaeronea, as I say, all of Greece effectively is under the League of Corinth. What is the League of Corinth? Well, each member state is pledged not to fight each other and not to engage in any foreign conflicts without permission from the League Congress. That is, the representatives from all the League members come together in a Congress, but the president of that Congress is the King of Macedon. And it looks like that king, in this case Philip and later Alexander, can more or less, I say more or less because it doesn't look like he was an absolute monarch, but he could more or less decide the policy of the League of Corinth. So is it just a kind of sinecure, a kind of a false front for bold-faced rule of Macedon? In a way, but there are times when pressures from League members can overcome the intentions of the king. But it serves to keep Macedon in charge of Greece. Eventually, Sparta will be made to join by force. I'm covering a lot of history here that could have been, we could spend days and days discussing how Philip achieves this ascendancy, but it's the new political reality. And the fact is that any of the old, if the old powers of Greece had earlier, before the Battle of Chaeronea, had come together on the same side, if Sparta, Thebes, and Athens and their allies had come together, they probably could have stopped Macedon. But though they did sometimes come together and fight on the same side, there were old animosities between these. You could understand why, Athens had a grudge against Sparta and vice versa. Sparta didn't like Thebes, and Athens had mixed feelings about Thebes, and Thebes had mixed feelings about Athens. So, they weren't inclined to work together. And by the time they did work together, it was too late. The kingdom of Macedon had already risen to a point where it was more or less unstoppable. I'd say earlier they could have perhaps stopped it, but they didn't. So the new political reality is a Macedonian-controlled Greece. Philip was quite an enlightened monarch. Most of his predecessors had been as well. They'd been cherry-picking scholars and prominent people from Athens, but other places as well. Remember, Euripides and Agathon and Pausanias will all go there under King Agesilaus. Oh, sorry, Archelaus II. Anyway, he lets these subject states more or less carry on. If they're democracies, he lets them continue to be democracies, except that they're no longer allowed to have a foreign policy, and they're not allowed to fight each other. They're under the control of under the supervision of Macedon, but still allowed to be more or less what they were, whatever form of government they had before, albeit sometimes with a Macedonian garrison parked in a citadel in the town. So why is Philip doing this? Well, his plan is to conquer the Persian Empire. Philip quite rightly sees the Persian Empire as ripe for the picking. They're divided. Certain parts have revolted, particularly in the east. Egypt is almost in a constant state of revolt, and the powers of the King of Kings are much reduced. So this is an opportunity. So Philip plans the expedition to go off and fight against the Persians, but he will be assassinated before he is able to do so. His son Alexander, of course, will lead that expedition against the Persian Empire. Philip's assassination seems to have been a personal matter. He's killed by the head of his bodyguard, a man named Pausanias, interestingly enough, not associated with that other Pausanias at all. This Pausanias had been a lover of the king. Philip had many lovers, male and female, in addition to his wives, and was jilted for a younger lover, and caused that young man to commit suicide, this older Pausanias, out of spite. But then, it's a long story, but essentially one of the generals who was friends with the younger lover got Pausanias drunk and had his mule drivers gang rape him. He went to the king asking for justice. The king was loath to cause any ill blood between him and one of his best generals, so he basically brushed it aside. That had happened some years previously, and Pausanias had been promoted to head of the bodyguard, so it's unclear if he'd been nursing that grievance or if something new had happened. There are allegations that the Persians had paid him. There are allegations that Alexander's mother Olympias had encouraged him to kill Philip. We don't know, and we probably will never know the full story, except I don't think Alexander was involved, although some of his detractors allege that he was. But when Philip is assassinated, Alexander is hailed king of Macedon. He then has to deal with some problems in Greece. Some of the allies to the north, the Illyrians, on the banks of the Danube, revolt, and he has to go and deal with them. While he's dealing with them, Thebes revolts, aided by Athens monetarily and with weapons, but not with troops. And they're told Alexander's dead at that point, which is probably why they revolt. But he, after defeating the others, the tribes near the Danube, he then makes a lightning march to Thebes, arriving there in very short time with most of his army and a number of his allies, and they have to put down the Thebans. He offers them terms, which they refuse, and in the end Thebes is razed to the ground and most of its population sold into slavery. Having settled affairs in Greece, however brutally, Alexander then, we can, if you're interested in Alexander, I won't go into more detail now. You can take one of my third-year modules that deal with him. But suffice it to say, he goes off to fight in Asia, leading the expedition that his father had planned. While he's gone, the Spartans revolt in 331, but that revolt is then put down by Alexander's viceroy in Greece, and Sparta is then made to join the League of Corinth. But Alexander, in a series of major battles, will defeat the Persian Empire, the Persian king. So the battles of Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela are the key ones. There are a number of others as well. And he will expand his empire. He will even go and conquer areas of the Persian Empire that they had lost, including into India. So he embarks on this 13-year expedition into the Persian Empire. He'll never return. He seems to be ruling his empire mainly from Babylon, but he gets ill, and we don't quite know what the illness was. But in 323, Alexander will die, leaving no heirs. Well, two heirs technically, but they're both one hadn't been born yet. That was his son, who would be Alexander IV, and another one named Heracles, who was considered illegitimate because he was the offspring of a concubine. So because there's no one old enough to lead his armies, his generals initially set up a kind of regency for his son and his half-brother Arrhidaeus both rule as co-monarchs, but with his half-brother we're not entirely sure what he had, some sort of disability that made people consider him unfit for rule. So it's a regency where the generals are in charge, but the generals fall to fighting. It's a long and complicated story, and I don't have time to go into it now, but essentially every member of the Argead royal dynasty of Macedon, Alexander's family, are killed by assassination or in warfare, including his mother, who would lead an army against one of the successors. And then we get what's called the Wars of the Successors. So the generals set themselves up as kings of different areas of the empire, each one trying to reform that empire, but they'll fight for centuries. We don't know what Alexander's plans were. We certainly don't expect that he intended to die in 323. But we have here, I have here his plans quoted in Diodorus of Sicily, one of the sources on Alexander. He was apparently planning to build a huge navy to go and conquer Carthage, possibly to conquer Rome, though Rome was a minor power at the time. Carthage was becoming a power. They had helped the Persians in the war against Alexander, so he was bound to go and defeat Carthage. He was going to conquer Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. There were plans to build huge temples throughout his empire, as well as harbors and roads all the way from Egypt to the Straits of Gibraltar. He was going to build a pyramid to his father Philip, bigger than the ones in Egypt, and so on and so forth. These plans were considered quite honorable, but the generals decided they were too expensive and would rather spend their money fighting each other, as it turns out. That's what Diodorus says. Another source on Alexander is not so sure whether he would have done these things or not, but this is what Arrian, Lucius Flavius Arrianus Xenophon, has to say about Alexander's plans. He says, "For my own part, I cannot conjecture with any certainty what were his plans, and I do not care to guess. But this I think I can confidently affirm, that he meditated nothing small or mean, that he would never have remained satisfied with any of the acquisitions he had made, even if he had added Europe to Asia, or the islands of the Britons to Europe. He would still have gone on seeking for some unknown land beyond those mentioned." And so we can almost imagine a parallel world in which Alexander didn't die and went on conquering. He was very good at conquering. And as Arrian says, he might have gone on to seek other lands, if he had managed to subdue Europe and Asia. He certainly wanted to go back to India. His army had revolted in India, and he had come back. They'd gone too far, and they were tired of fighting. He was planning on going back there as well, we know. Would he have discovered the Americas and settled and colonized them? Possibly. Ancient empires had limits in size, as the Persians would found out, and as the Romans would discover too. You need communications, and you need to be able to get from one part to the other. But again, the British solved this problem with technology. I have a feeling that Alexander's empire would have done the same, but that's not what happened. The last plans of Alexander were put aside, and the generals, known as the Diadochi, which means the successors, would fight. And I put more in the notes about them. They divide his empire twice. There's the partition of Babylon and the partition of the settlement of Triparadisius, the first Diadochi War, followed by a series of others. And the fighting goes on and on. Even after the major wars of the successors are over, there's a kind of period of Cold War between them. The last of the successor kingdoms is Egypt, which will then fall under Roman control with the death of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. So that the Hellenistic era, the long, bloody Hellenistic era, follows from Alexander's death to about 30 BC, after the Battle of Actium and the fall of Egypt to Rome, although again, arguably, the Hellenistic continuum is something that we're still a part of today. What characterized this period? So we've seen, the political side, the geopolitical side, the conquest, and it was a very violent period. This was a period of almost perpetual war, not just in the wider empire of Alexander, between the generals, but in Greece itself. Southern Greece gets independence from Macedon, but then ends up fighting them. That's how the Romans will get pulled into to Greece and end up just occupying the region. But I want to talk about the Hellenistic Age itself and what characterizes it. So it's this period from the death of Alexander. There's a change in style of governance, because the Greek world and the wider Greek world, which extends all the way to India, is dominated by Alexander's generals, who are Macedonian and who don't think in terms of democracy. They think in terms of king and court. That is the dominant form of government. Athens, which had been allowed to continue under democracy with its under the successors to Alexander in Macedon, the democracy is rolled back considerably, and eventually an oligarchy will replace it, and that'll be the end of democracy in Athens, really, up until modern times. So king and court come to dominate, and this is highly illustrated in the sort of works of art that you can see and things that these kings were making. So you can see the altar of Zeus at Pergamum there. Pergamum is in one of effectively what's in Syria today. It was one of the successor kingdoms. The jewelry, works of architecture. There's the great library at Alexandria, begun under Ptolemy I, finished under Ptolemy II. They like to put their wealth on display, these Hellenistic monarchs. So we sometimes refer to them as Hellenistic god kings, right? Alexander was worshipped as a living god. Some of his successors would be as well, particularly those in Egypt, but even the ones that weren't acted as if they were gods. We get some advancements in technology too during this period. So the aeropile of Heron, the steam engine, a more sophisticated form of water clock. I've mentioned the Antikythera engine before. This is a mechanical computer for calculating the phases of the moon and other things in the heavens. These kinds of technological wonders are being created, but not widely shared, but hoarded by whoever made them. What is Hellenistic culture like? So there's a lot of trade, not just in goods, but in ideas. The capitals of these cities ruled by their Hellenistic kings are, aggrandized and built up to promote their status. We get the common tongue, koine. So in a sense, for the first time, Europe and Asia are united by a common language. That's common Greek. This is the Greek that the New Testament will be written in. In terms of sort of the more local level, though, we see people sort of turning inward. All right, this is the age of the individual. If the Hellenic age was the age of participation and citizens who engage in their government, and the Greek word for private citizen is idiotes. I mean, it's what gives us idiot. Someone who just looked to their private lives and didn't attend to public matters was considered negative. But under courts and kings, most people don't get to engage in government, and monarchs and aristocrats, present themselves as sort of models, a bit like the way billionaires and millionaires do today. People look up to them for whatever reasons I'll never quite fathom, but and so the individual becomes more important. Mystery religions, which had already existed before, really take off. All kinds of religions take off during this period, and philosophies as well. Hellenistic philosophers turn their focus inward. So we get the cynics, who, like Diogenes, who expressed life as an expression, as a protest against commercialism and cosmopolitanism. He called politicians the lackeys of the mob. But then the Epicureans and Stoics come along too, and I'll come back to those in a moment. We get a change in drama too, and you'll recall Old Comedy of Aristophanes, and I talked about New Comedy a little bit at the time. Old Comedy is about heavily into political criticism, naming and shaming politicians and targeting them for satire. That works in a democracy where freedom of speech is allowed. It's not the sort of thing that goes down well with aristocrats and monarchical regimes. So New Comedy, largely represented by Menander, though there are other playwrights as well, focuses again more on the individual. It becomes the comedy of situation and place and romantic comedy. It's the birth of the sitcom and romantic comedy, because these things can be largely non-political or apolitical. There are references to political events, but it's very, very light. It's all about lovers who can't get with their girlfriends because of a jealous partner, or her father is keeping her away, or something like that, and how they get around it. Menander, born around 342 BC, he was one of a number, but he was probably the best of the best, and the Roman playwrights would imitate him. I put more in the notes. Euripides had some influence on Menander, so there are sort of keen observations of psychology, but like I say, it's a turning more towards the individual than it is society at large. Morality is important, and this is a big theme for the philosophers. So I'll come back to Epicureanism in a minute, but I've mentioned Stoicism before. This derives partly out of the Platonist school, but a man named Zeno of Citium, not to be confused with the other Zeno of a couple of centuries previously, who had developed the paradoxes. Citium, by the way, is modern-day Larnaca on Cyprus. This is where he was from. Pardon me, born around 334. He would come to Athens. He was a merchant from a merchant family, so fairly well off. He would come to Athens and study philosophy, fall in love with philosophy, and found his own school known as the Stoa. And it's called that because he would walk around in a colonnade, the Stoas, remember these colonnaded buildings, and philosophize. And that's what the name comes from. He argued essentially that philosophers should avoid political matters altogether. They should be concerned with theory, rather than praxis, practical things. This didn't stop a number of Stoics from going on to have political careers, including one of Zeno's own students, a man named Persius, would go on to advise the kings of Macedon, or one of the kings, and even be given charge of the city of Corinth at one point himself. But what did the Stoics teach? They taught that one should try to achieve a state of apatheia. That doesn't mean apathy exactly, but it means an emotional detachment from the horrors of the world, and to achieve ataraxia, freedom from anxiety. And one way to do this is to sort of practice indifference to pain and pleasure, and suppress the influence of the passions by means of meditation. The Stoics believed in the gods. They believed in immortality of the soul, but different Stoics have different sort of beliefs about this. They seem to have thought, or some did at any rate, that history repeats itself in cyclical patterns and following cycles of destruction and renewal, and it's not just about states going into decline and others being born. The whole of history, they felt, or some did, followed this pattern. So eventually the world will be destroyed and then reform, and everything that's happened before will happen again. So it's this endless cycle. They never quite managed to square this. It's almost like a predestination principle. If that's the case, then why should you bother practicing Stoic philosophy? Because you're going to do what you did last time anyway. Like I say, not all of them agreed on these matters, but Stoicism would have a lot of influence on a range of other philosophies, including potentially Hinduism, and certainly to some extent Christianity and Islam, but it has more in common with things like Taoism and Sufism, the mystical practices. You can read more about Stoicism in the notes. The other major school of philosophy that develops during this period, and again partly in response to the horrors of war that were perpetrated at the time, is Epicureanism. A man named Epicurus develops this theory. A lot of his views, and his dates are 341 to 270. A lot of his views derive from the atomists, so Democritus and Leucippus. And the Stoics also believe in the gods, but they believe the gods have nothing to do with us. The gods exist in a state of perfect bliss, very far away, and nothing we can do can tempt them. So there's no point in praying to the gods or offering sacrifices, because they won't do anything for us even if they could. They believe the soul is not immortal, that it's made of atoms, and when one dies, the atoms just disperse and the soul ceases to exist. This is meant to be seen as a positive thing, though, because they consider they also had the goal of ataraxia, or freedom from anxiety, in their philosophy. And the idea is that if you're not concerned with what's going to happen after death, then you're not going to worry about it. There's no reason to worry, because nothing happens, and you won't be there to worry. Some people wouldn't find that particularly comforting, but they apparently did. They also preached moderation, just like the Stoics did, deriving much from Platonic philosophy. The Epicureans often get confused with hedonists. That, in other words, to be Epicurean is to engage in excessive pleasure, but in fact that's not what Epicurus taught at all. Engaging in excesses leads to bodily dysfunctions, which then makes one not be free from anxiety. So it's about moderation, just as it is with the Stoics. They have very similar goals, and I put more in the notes there. Um, I've put also some things in about the wars with the wars of the successors. I'm not going to go through the Battle of Ipsius now, but this is one of those that sort of settles the affairs more or less in Greece, you know, under, well, I say in Greece and in the broader empire as well, into a kind of Cold War state. There's Euclid and his mathematical school. This is founded at Athens around 300 BC, picking up on the mathematics of Plato's Academy and Pythagoreanism. So, you know, there are some advancements being made in the sciences and mathematics, but these are advancements that are just sort of have already existed. They're just being kind of fine-tuned. There's Archimedes, right? I think we might have talked about him before. I can't recall. Yeah, I think we did. His use of optics and mechanics to defend Sicily against the Romans, and we're getting into the rise of Rome during this period. I put a lot in the notes about Archimedes and his advancements, and it's hard to say how much of these the Romans would have gotten hold of some of these things, but not all. This happens during what are called the Punic Wars between between Rome and Carthage, in which the Greek world plays a kind of peripheral role. Sicily was Greek, but it was allied with the Carthaginians at that point. Archimedes, unfortunately, was killed, and so his more advanced technologies, like his laser, which was used to sink ships, was using sort of solar energy focused either with a mirror or with lenses or both. That seems to have been lost. Some of his other advancements might have been saved. The Romans certainly were keen on getting hold of these things. Some works were found. Some works of his or works about his engineering survive, but figure into the medieval Islamic world and were lost to the West. In Greece itself, from around 281, the Achaean League is formed. This is to resist the kingdom of Macedon. There'll be two of these. The Second Achaean League around 280, but this is again where it's what will bring the Romans into Greece, and from 168 they'll just stay, or 146 the Romans will just stay there. They'll carve up the kingdom of Macedon into provinces and just control the rest of Greece and defeat the Achaean League as well, and come to dominate Greece, and will eventually come to dominate much of Alexander's old empire. During the continuing wars between the successors of Alexander, we get the Colossus of Rhodes. That was built when one of the successor kings, named Demetrius Paleokites, Demetrius the Besieger, tries to take Rhodes. He's defeated, but he leaves behind his siege engines, and they use it to build this Colossus, use these things to build the Colossus. It probably looked more like the one in the upper right-hand corner of the picture, rather than spanning the harbor. And it's a bit like the Statue of Liberty. Unfortunately, it would be hit by an earthquake in 226 BC, and that would be the end of it. Wrapping up the Hellenistic Age, getting into just before the Punic Wars, the kingdom of Epirus comes into Italy to help some of the Greek city-states there in Greater Greece defend against the Romans. And Pyrrhus of Epirus, who's a cousin of Alexander the Great, would lead this expedition. He would be successful. He would actually have 3 major victories against the Romans at the time, but the victories were rather harsh. He lost a lot of troops, a lot of soldiers during these victories, and the Romans kept coming back. They were very good at reforming their armies when they'd been defeated. So Pyrrhus famously said, "One more such victory and I'm undone." Thus we get the word Pyrrhic victory. So the Pyrrhic Wars from 280 to 275. He'll eventually just sort of give up and go off and fight a war on Sicily, and then head back to Epirus. He does all right for himself in his career, but doesn't really make a lasting impression on Italy, except to maybe rally the Romans against the Greeks. And I've put more in the notes about there are four Macedonian wars between, gosh, 214 BC and going down to 148, and that will end with the Romans occupying Greece and the Kingdom of Macedon. And then, yeah, the Greek Achaean League tried unsuccessfully to get rid of the Romans, but the city of Corinth would end up being destroyed as part of the uprising, and Rome then expands its empire into the Greek world in 148. Like I say, the Hellenistic Greek world, though conquered by the Romans, would conquer the Romans in turn culturally. There's a famous quote from a Roman poet named Horace. It translates into the conquered, having been conquered, conquered the conqueror. And it's even weirder in Latin. But anyway, it means that though Greece was conquered by Rome, Greek culture would conquer Rome. And as I said at the beginning, that culture, that technology, those ideas would come to dominate the East and the West in many respects to this very day, having undergone a number of mutations. We have a kind of interruption in it during the Dark Ages from about the 5th century until about the 15th century. But as I say, when Constantinople falls, all that learning, all the Greek learning that had been preserved there and had been lost to the West was rediscovered, and we get the Renaissance, which is the rebirth of classical culture. And so in a sense we get Hellenistic Greece recreated in Europe, albeit with now the printing press and gunpowder and some other things the Greeks didn't have. So the modern world is a logical extension of the Hellenistic world. This includes things like liberal democracy, liberal or humanism, those sorts of things. It also includes, unfortunately, things like fascism and Nazism. These are logical developments out of the Hellenistic continuum. In many respects, we're still in it. And even though the rest of the world didn't, or some of the rest of the world didn't experience the Hellenistic continuum directly, they're still influenced by it as well. So all the Western influences on places like China, Japan, etc., have this Hellenistic influence. I'll end it there, and like I said, I put a lot more in the notes for people to see if they're interested, but things could have turned out very differently at several key points if Athens had not lost the Peloponnesian Wars, if Alexander had not died when he did. It would be a very different world. As it happens, the one that we inherited came about as a consequence of these things and the realignment of powers following the fallout from Alexander's empire, which led to the ascendancy of Rome. We'll leave it there, and if you're interested in these matters, you can take some of my other classes in next year and beyond. But I'll thank you very much for your visit to ancient Greece and hope that you have enjoyed your time there. Goodbye for now.
You Ψεύδι βασίλη